There is a moment in every connection with someone emotionally distant where you feel it, the pull and the push, the warmth followed by sudden coldness, the feeling that something real exists, yet it keeps slipping through your hands. It can leave you confused, questioning yourself, wondering what you did wrong, or why the deeper you try to love, the further they seem to drift away. But what if the answer is not in loving harder, not in saying more, not in proving your worth, but in understanding the hidden world they live in? Because the truth is, emotional distance is not the absence of desire, it is the presence of fear. And behind that fear, there is something most people never take the time to see, a private world of fantasies that quietly shape everything they do. If you can understand that world, not manipulate it, not force your way into it, but align with it, you begin to change the entire dynamic, not by chasing them, but by becoming someone they feel safe staying with. And that is where everything begins to shift. There is a hidden psychology at play that most people completely miss. On the surface, they seem independent, self-contained, even emotionally unavailable. They might say they don't need much, that they prefer space, that they value their freedom above all else. But beneath that exterior is a constant internal conflict. Part of them deeply desires connection, closeness, intimacy, the kind that feels real and grounding. And another part of them is wired to fear it, not because they don't care, but because closeness to them feels unpredictable, overwhelming, and sometimes even threatening. So they live in this silent tug of war. When they feel distance, they lean in. When they feel closeness, they pull away. And from the outside, it can feel like inconsistency, like mixed signals, like emotional confusion. But from the inside, it feels like survival. Understanding this changes how you interpret everything, because their behavior is not random. It is patterned, protective, and deeply rooted. And within that internal world, there is something even more important to understand. They don't just avoid reality, they create a version of connection that feels safer to them, a version that exists more in imagination than in real life. They fantasize about love, but not in the way most people think. It's not about grand gestures or dramatic romance. It's about a feeling, effortless connection, no pressure, no expectations, no risk of being overwhelmed or losing themselves. In their mind, love is something that flows without demands. It doesn't require constant emotional labor. It doesn't corner them or ask them to explain feelings they don't fully understand themselves. It simply exists, calmly, naturally, without tension. And because reality rarely matches that internal vision, they often retreat further into that fantasy. Not consciously, not deliberately, but as a way to feel safe. This is where most people unintentionally push them away. Because traditional expressions of love, wanting clarity, consistency, reassurance, deeper emotional conversations, can feel completely normal and healthy to one person, but overwhelming to someone who is wired this way. What feels like connection to you can feel like pressure to them. What feels like honesty can feel like exposure. And the more they feel that pressure, even if it's coming from genuine love, the more they instinctively create distance. Not because they want to leave, but because they feel like they have to, in order to regain emotional balance. And that's the shift that changes everything. Because if you keep approaching them the way most people approach relationships, through intensity, urgency, or emotional demand, you will continue to trigger that same cycle. But if you begin to understand what actually feels safe to them, what aligns with their internal world, something different starts to happen. They don't feel the need to escape. They don't feel cornered. Instead, they begin to relax into the connection, and when they relax, they stay. At the core of their behavior is something they rarely put into words, a deep attachment to the idea of freedom, not just physical freedom, but emotional freedom, the ability to exist without feeling controlled, obligated, or consumed. For them, independence is not just a preference, it is protection. It is the way they maintain a sense of identity and stability. And any situation that threatens that, even unintentionally, can trigger their instinct to pull away. This is why they are often drawn to connections that feel light, open, and undefined, because those dynamics allow them to feel connected without feeling trapped. But here's where it becomes more complex. That same need for freedom is also what creates their deepest longing, because while they protect their independence, they also quietly crave a connection that doesn't threaten it. A connection where they can be close without feeling overwhelmed, where they can be understood without having to explain everything, where they can come and go emotionally without fear of judgment or pressure. This is the paradox they live in. They want closeness, but only if it feels safe. They want connection, but only if it doesn't feel like a loss of control. And this is where most people misunderstand them completely. They assume distance means disinterest. They assume silence means lack of care. They assume inconsistency means they don't value the connection. But in many cases, it's the opposite. The more they feel something real, the more cautious they become. The more they care, the more they feel the need to protect themselves. And without understanding this, it becomes easy to misinterpret their actions and respond in ways that push them even further away. What they secretly fantasize about is not perfection, but ease. A connection that doesn't feel heavy. A bond that doesn't require constant negotiation or emotional intensity. Someone who doesn't chase, doesn't demand, doesn't overwhelm, but also doesn't disappear. Someone who exists in a space that feels steady, calm, and non-threatening. And when they find that, even if they don't fully understand why, they begin to attach in a way that feels natural to them. But that kind of connection doesn't come from trying to win them over or prove your value. It comes from a different kind of presence. One that isn't rooted in fear of losing them, but in certainty within yourself. Because the moment you begin to chase, to seek validation, to push for clarity before they are ready, the dynamic shifts, and not in your favor. It reinforces their belief that closeness leads to pressure, that connection leads to loss of freedom. And once that belief is triggered, they retreat, not always physically, but emotionally. On the other hand, when you begin to embody a sense of calm independence, when your presence feels grounding rather than demanding, something changes. You become aligned with the very thing they are unconsciously searching for, not because you are playing a role, but because you are no longer trying to force an outcome. And in that space, they feel something different, something rare, something they don't often experience. This doesn't mean ignoring your needs or suppressing your emotions. It means understanding the rhythm of the dynamic you are in. Recognizing that not every connection operates the same way, and more importantly, realizing that attraction for them is not built through intensity, it is built through safety, through subtlety, through the absence of pressure. And when you begin to see it clearly, you stop taking their behavior personally, you stop reacting impulsively to their distance, you stop trying to fix something that was never about you to begin with. Instead, you start responding with awareness, with intention, with emotional control. And that is where your power returns, because at the end of the day, the goal is not to control them or make them stay. It's to create a dynamic where staying feels natural to them, where leaving no longer feels necessary. And that doesn't happen through force, it happens through alignment. And once you understand the hidden psychology behind their actions, once you see the fantasies that quietly guide their behavior, you begin to move differently. You stop chasing, you stop overgiving, you stop trying to prove your worth to someone who is not wired to respond to that approach. Instead, you become someone who understands the space they need without losing yourself in the process. And that is the beginning of a completely different kind of connection. One where the cycle begins to break. One where distance no longer feels like rejection. One where you are no longer reacting, you are leading the emotional tone of the connection without forcing it. Because the truth is, they are not looking for someone to complete them. They are looking for someone who doesn't take away from who they are. And when you become that, without losing your own center, something shifts in a way that no amount of chasing ever could. And that is only the beginning. Because once you start to understand what feels safe to them, you begin to see something even deeper. The kind of love they are actually drawn to is not intense in the way most people expect. It is quiet. It is subtle. It is almost invisible to anyone who is used to loud, expressive, emotionally charged relationships. They are not chasing chaos. They are not looking for someone who overwhelms them with constant attention or emotional urgency. What they are unconsciously searching for is something that feels effortless, a connection that does not feel like work, a presence that does not feel like pressure. And this is where the idea of effortless love becomes so important, because in their inner world, love is not supposed to feel heavy. It is not supposed to feel like something they have to manage or constantly respond to. It is something that flows without friction, something that exists without needing to be defined every moment. And when they encounter someone who brings intensity too quickly, even if it comes from a genuine place, it disrupts that sense of ease. It creates tension where they crave calm, and that tension is what makes them step back. Not because they don't feel anything, but because what they feel becomes too much, too fast, and too difficult to process. But here is the part that most people don't realize. They are not avoiding love itself. They are avoiding the feeling of losing control within it. They are avoiding the emotional weight that often comes with it. And when a connection feels light, when it feels natural, when it doesn't demand constant emotional output, they begin to lean in without even realizing it. They start to stay longer. They start to open up in small, quiet ways. Not all at once, not dramatically, but gradually. And those small openings mean more than most people understand. There is also a delicate balance they are constantly trying to maintain, even if they are not consciously aware of it. The balance between emotional safety and emotional intensity. Too much intensity, and they feel overwhelmed. Too much distance, and they feel disconnected. What they are drawn to is something in between, a space where they can feel something real without feeling consumed by it. And finding that balance is what keeps them engaged. This is why some connections feel magnetic to them, while others quickly fade. It is not always about how much effort is given or how strong the feelings are. It is about how those feelings are experienced. If the connection feels like a wave crashing over them, they will retreat. But if it feels like a steady current, something they can move with rather than fight against, they begin to relax into it. And when they relax, they allow themselves to feel more. And this is where mystery begins to play a powerful role. Not in the sense of playing games or pretending to be someone you're not, but in the sense of not revealing everything all at once, not making yourself completely predictable or emotionally available in every single moment, because when everything is laid out too quickly, when there is no space left for curiosity, the connection can start to feel too defined, too fixed. And for someone who values emotional freedom, that can feel limiting. They are drawn to what they don't fully understand, to what they can't completely predict, not because they enjoy confusion, but because curiosity keeps them engaged without making them feel trapped. When there is a sense of discovery, when they feel like there is always more to learn, more to explore, the connection stays alive in their mind. It continues to exist beyond the moments you share. And that lingering presence is what deepens their attachment over time. But the moment they feel like everything is known, everything is expected, everything is set, something inside them begins to pull back. Not because you did something wrong, but because the connection no longer feels open. It no longer feels like something they can move within freely. And that sense of restriction, even if it is subtle, is enough to trigger their instinct to create distance. This ties directly into another pattern that defines their attraction. They are often drawn to what feels just out of reach, not completely unavailable, not distant to the point of disconnection, but not fully accessible either. There is something about that slight distance that feels safe to them, because it allows them to engage without feeling overwhelmed. It gives them space to approach on their own terms. When something is too available, too consistent, too predictable, it can start to feel like pressure, like an expectation they have to meet. And expectations to them can feel heavy. They can feel like obligations rather than choices. And the moment something feels like an obligation, their desire begins to fade. But when there is space, when there is a sense that the connection exists without constant demand, they begin to move closer. They begin to invest more, not because they are being pushed, but because they feel free to do so. And that freedom is what keeps them emotionally present. At the core of all of this is one of their deepest, most unspoken desires, the fantasy of being understood without having to explain themselves. They want to feel seen, but they struggle to express what they feel. They want to feel known, but they often don't have the words or the comfort to reveal everything that is happening inside them. So they hold it in. They keep parts of themselves hidden, not because they want to deceive, but because vulnerability feels unfamiliar and risky. And because of that, they are incredibly sensitive to how they are perceived. If they feel misunderstood, judged, or pressured to open up before they are ready, they retreat further into themselves. But if they feel like someone understands them without forcing it, without demanding explanations, something shifts. They begin to feel safe in a way that is rare for them. That kind of understanding does not come from constant questioning or emotional probing. It comes from presence, from paying attention to what they show in subtle ways, from recognizing their patterns without trying to control them. And when they feel that, when they feel like someone sees them without trying to change them, it creates a level of comfort that is hard for them to walk away from. But the moment pressure enters the dynamic, everything changes, and this is where many people lose the connection without even realizing why, because pressure does not always look obvious. It is not always direct demands or ultimatums. Sometimes it is subtle. It is the need for constant reassurance, the expectation of immediate responses, the desire to define the relationship before they are ready, the emotional weight placed on them to meet certain needs. And while these things may be completely valid in a different dynamic, to them it feels overwhelming. It feels like something they cannot sustain. And instead of expressing that directly, they do what feels safest. They pull away. They create space. They distance themselves emotionally or physically. Not because they don't care, but because they don't know how to stay without feeling like they are losing themselves. And this is the point where many people react in ways that reinforce the cycle. They push harder. They seek clarity. They try to close the distance. But to someone who already feels overwhelmed, that only intensifies the need to escape. It confirms their internal belief that closeness leads to pressure, that connection leads to loss of freedom. But when you understand this pattern, when you see the deeper reasons behind their behavior, you begin to respond differently. You don't chase, you don't demand, you don't react from fear. Instead, you create space without disconnecting. You remain present without becoming overwhelming. And in that space, something changes. They begin to feel the absence of pressure. They begin to experience connection in a way that does not trigger their defense mechanisms. And slowly, without force, they start to come closer, not because they are being pulled, but because they feel safe enough to move on their own. And that is where the dynamic transforms, because instead of being someone they feel the need to escape from, you become someone they feel at ease with, someone who does not disrupt their internal balance, but aligns with it. And when that happens, the connection no longer feels like something they have to manage. It becomes something they can exist within, something they can return to, something they begin to value in a way they may not even fully understand themselves. Because for the first time, they are not choosing between connection and freedom. They are experiencing both at the same time, and that is what makes them stay. Because for the first time, they are not experiencing connection as something that takes away from them, but as something that allows them to remain who they are, while still feeling close to someone else. And when that shift happens, something deeper begins to form, something that is not built on intensity or pressure, but on a quiet sense of emotional compatibility that feels almost effortless. This is where emotional independence becomes one of the most powerful forces in the dynamic. Not independence as a strategy, not as something you perform to create distance, but as something real and grounded within you. Because they are constantly observing, constantly sensing whether your emotional state depends on them. And the moment they feel that your stability is tied to their behavior, something inside them tightens. It creates an invisible weight, an unspoken responsibility they are not prepared to carry. And that weight is what makes them step back. But when you are emotionally independent, when your sense of self, your peace, your direction does not fluctuate based on their presence or absence, they feel something completely different. They feel relief. They feel space. They feel like they can exist in the connection without being responsible for holding it together. And that is what allows them to stay present longer, without feeling the need to escape. Because the truth is, they are not looking for someone who needs them in a way that feels overwhelming. They are drawn to someone who chooses them, but does not depend on them. Someone who has their own center, their own life, their own emotional grounding. And when they feel that, it creates a kind of attraction that is not based on intensity, but on stability. A stability they may not even realize they are craving until they experience it. And this leads into one of the most misunderstood dynamics when it comes to them, the reason they often stay longer when they feel free to leave. It sounds contradictory at first, but it is deeply connected to how they process connection. When they feel like they are expected to stay, when there is pressure to commit, define or prove something, it triggers resistance. It makes the connection feel like an obligation rather than a choice. And once something feels like an obligation, their instinct is to create distance. But when they feel like they have the freedom to leave at any time, something shifts. The pressure disappears, the weight lifts, and in that absence of pressure, they begin to choose to stay. Not because they have to, not because they are being held in place, but because they genuinely want to be there. And that choice, when it comes from them, is far more powerful than anything that could be forced. This is why trying to secure them through control, through constant reassurance, or through pushing for clarity often has the opposite effect. It removes the very thing that allows them to feel comfortable, their sense of autonomy. And without that, the connection begins to feel restrictive. But when autonomy is preserved, when they feel like they are engaging in the connection freely, they begin to invest in it more deeply. There is also a fantasy they hold that most people never fully understand, the idea of a love that does not demand change, not because they are unwilling to grow, but because they fear losing themselves in the process of meeting someone else's expectations. They fear that in order to be loved, they will have to become something they are not, that they will have to adjust, adapt, or compromise parts of themselves that feel essential to who they are. And because of that, they are highly sensitive to any sign that they are being shaped or molded. Even subtle attempts to change their behavior, to push them toward a certain way of expressing themselves, can create resistance. It can make them feel like they are not being accepted as they are. And that feeling, even if it is unintentional, can cause them to withdraw. But when they feel accepted, when they feel like they can exist as they are without being corrected or reshaped, something opens within them. They begin to relax, they begin to trust, and in that space of acceptance, they often become more willing to grow naturally, without being forced, because growth for them has to come from within. It cannot be imposed from the outside. This is where emotional timing becomes crucial, knowing when to lean in and when to step back, when to engage and when to allow space, because their rhythm is different. It is not linear. It does not follow a predictable pattern of increasing closeness. It moves in waves, moments of connection followed by moments of distance, and if you try to force consistency in a way that ignores that rhythm, you disrupt the balance. But when you begin to move with that rhythm instead of against it, something changes. You stop reacting to every shift. You stop interpreting distance as rejection. You begin to understand that their need for space is not a sign that the connection is failing, but a way for them to process and maintain their sense of self. And when you allow that space without fear, without overreaction, it creates a sense of stability that they can feel. And that stability becomes something they begin to rely on. Not in an obvious way, not through constant expression, but through a quiet recognition that the connection does not collapse under pressure, that it can breathe, that it can expand and contract without breaking, and that is what allows it to last. Within this dynamic, there is also a subtle but powerful art, the art of non-attachment, not detachment in the sense of not caring, but non-attachment in the sense of not clinging, not trying to control the outcome, not holding on so tightly that the connection loses its natural flow, because the tighter you hold, the more they feel it, and the more they feel it, the more they instinctively pull away. But when you care without clinging, when you remain present without becoming dependent, it creates a completely different experience for them. They do not feel trapped, they do not feel responsible for managing your emotions. They feel free to engage, to connect, to move closer at their own pace, and that freedom is what allows the connection to deepen naturally. This is also where silence begins to take on a new meaning, because in most dynamics, silence is interpreted as distance, as disinterest, as something negative. But in this dynamic, silence can be powerful, not as a tool to manipulate, but as a space that allows them to feel, to think, to return. When you fill every gap, when you constantly reach out, when you remove all space, it can feel overwhelming to them. It leaves no room for them to come toward you on their own. But when there is space, when there are moments of quiet, something happens internally. They begin to notice your absence. They begin to feel the connection in a different way, not as something that is always there, but as something that they can move toward. And that movement is important. Because the more they initiate, the more they invest. The more they invest, the more the connection begins to matter to them. And that investment cannot be forced. It has to come from their own desire to engage. And this leads to one of the most important shifts in the entire dynamic, the understanding that they need to feel like they are choosing you, not being convinced, not being persuaded, not being pulled in through effort or persistence, but choosing you freely. Because choice is what preserves their sense of autonomy. It is what allows them to stay without feeling like they are losing themselves. The moment they feel like they are being controlled, even in subtle ways, that sense of choice disappears, and when it disappears, so does their comfort. But when they feel like every step they take toward you is their own decision, something changes. They become more invested, more present, more willing to stay. And that is the paradox that defines everything. You do not keep them by holding on tightly. You keep them by creating a space where they never feel the need to escape, a space where connection does not feel like pressure, a space where closeness does not feel like control, a space where they can be fully themselves without fear. And when that space exists, they do something that cannot be forced, rushed, or demanded. They stay. And when they stay in that way, without pressure, without force, without feeling like they are losing themselves, you begin to notice something subtle but powerful. The connection starts to feel different, not just for them, but for you as well. It no longer feels like something you are constantly trying to hold together. It begins to feel like something that exists on its own, something that breathes naturally, without being managed every moment. And that is where the emotional environment you create becomes everything. Because what ultimately makes them stay is not a single action, not a perfect message, not a specific moment. It is the overall feeling they experience when they are connected to you. It is the emotional atmosphere, and that atmosphere is built through consistency, without pressure, presence without control, and understanding without overreaction. When they feel like being around you does not disrupt their inner balance, they begin to associate you with calm rather than conflict, with ease rather than expectation. And over time, that association becomes something they don't want to lose. But here is where it becomes important to be honest with yourself. Because in trying to understand them, in trying to align with their needs, there is a risk that many people fall into without realizing it. The risk of slowly losing themselves in the process, of becoming so focused on maintaining the connection that they begin to ignore their own needs, their own boundaries, their own emotional truth. And while adapting to a dynamic can be healthy, over-adapting is where things begin to break down. Because a connection that requires you to abandon yourself is not sustainable. It creates an imbalance. It turns the relationship into something one-sided, where one person is constantly adjusting, while the other remains protected within their own space. And over time, that imbalance leads to frustration, resentment, and emotional exhaustion. Not always immediately, not always in obvious ways, but gradually, quietly. This is why self-respect has to remain your foundation. Not as a defense, not as a wall, but as a steady sense of who you are and what you deserve. Because understanding them does not mean accepting everything. It does not mean tolerating behavior that consistently leaves you feeling unseen or unvalued. It means recognizing the difference between giving space and losing your voice, between being patient and abandoning your needs. And this balance is what defines whether the connection becomes something meaningful or something draining. Because when you maintain your center, when you stay grounded in yourself while still allowing the connection to exist naturally, you create something rare, a dynamic where both people can exist without one losing themselves to accommodate the other. And when that happens, something shifts in them as well, because they begin to feel that you are not dependent on the connection to feel complete, that you are choosing to be there, not needing to be there. And that distinction matters more than most people realize, because need creates pressure, but choice creates freedom, and freedom is what allows them to stay. At this point, the dynamic reaches a level where it is no longer about tactics or understanding patterns. It becomes about presence, about how you show up consistently, without forcing anything. And in that space, the connection either deepens naturally or reveals its limitations, because not every connection, no matter how much you understand it, is meant to last. And this is where the final truth begins to unfold. You do not keep someone by becoming exactly what they need at the cost of yourself. You do not secure a connection by perfectly aligning with every nuance of their behavior. Because real connection is not built on adaptation alone. It is built on mutual alignment, on both people feeling safe, respected, and free within the same space. And when that alignment exists, something becomes very clear. You are not trying to hold them. You are not trying to convince them. You are not trying to make them stay. They are staying because the connection feels right to them, because it does not trigger their need to escape, because it does not threaten their sense of self, and at the same time, it does not diminish yours, because the most powerful shift in this entire journey is not in how they behave, it is in how you see yourself within the connection. When you stop seeing them as something to win, something to figure out, something to hold on to at all costs, and start seeing the connection as something that either aligns with you or does not, everything changes. You stop chasing clarity. You stop overanalyzing every shift. You stop tying your emotional state to their presence or absence. And in that space you become grounded, not distant, not detached, but centered, and that energy is something they can feel. It is something that creates respect, not through words but through presence. Because when you are grounded in yourself, you no longer react impulsively to their distance. You no longer try to close every gap. You allow the connection to exist without forcing it into a shape that feels secure to you but overwhelming to them, and in doing so you create something that feels natural to both of you. But there is also a deeper layer to this, because sometimes the connection does not evolve the way you hope it will. Sometimes, even with understanding, even with patience, even with emotional awareness, the dynamic remains unbalanced. And in those moments, the most important thing is not how to make them stay. It is recognizing when staying no longer serves you. Because real power is not just in creating connection, it is in knowing when to walk away from one that cannot meet you where you are. And that decision is not rooted in frustration or anger. It is rooted in clarity, in self-respect, in the understanding that connection should not come at the cost of your emotional well-being. And when you reach that level of clarity, something profound happens. You are no longer attached to the outcome. You are open to the connection, but not dependent on it. You are present, but not consumed. And in that state, whether they stay or leave, you remain whole. And ironically, that is the state where they are most likely to stay, because you are no longer trying to control the connection. You are allowing it to exist freely. And in that freedom, they find something they rarely experience: connection without pressure, closeness without fear, presence without expectation. And that is what makes it different. That is what makes it real. Because at the end of everything, beyond all the patterns, beyond all the understanding, beyond all the strategies, the truth is simple. You do not keep them by playing a role. You do not keep them by becoming what you think they want. You do not keep them by holding on tighter. You create a space where they feel safe enough to stay, and then you let them choose, because if they choose you freely, without pressure, without fear, without losing themselves in the process, they don't just stay. They stay in a way that finally feels real.